guys, Richard Holder here, and welcome to the channel. Who wants to see a comparison between a Vortech centrifugal supercharger and a pair of twin turbos on a 4.6 liter 2-valve mod motor? Now actually, this comparison works on any motor. In this video, I'm going to illustrate a comparison between a Vortech centrifugal supercharger and twin turbos. In this video, I've actually got two different test motors, but they're very similar. Both of them were 4.6 liter 2-valve non-PI short blocks. Both of them had ported heads. Both of them had aftermarket cams. Both of them had PI intake manifolds. One we ran with a Vortech centrifugal supercharger and an intercooler. The other we ran with HP Performance twin turbos and an intercooler. So how do the two compare? Before we can get to our comparison on turbocharging and supercharging on a 4.6 liter 2-valve motor, we need to go over the test motors. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to run the Vortech and turbos on the same combination, but this should still give you a fairly good idea as a comparison between the different forms of boost levels, because the motors were fairly comparable. So our first test motor, I'm going to show you what the NA power did and what it did with the Vortech. And then on the next one, we'll show you what the NA power did and then what it did with the turbos. And then we can kind of compare all that. So our first test motor was actually a hybrid. It was an early non-PI motor, a non-PI short block, equipped with ported PI heads. It had the PI intake manifold and the stock PI throttle body. We ran this thing with long tube headers, with a fast XFI management system, and we started with a set of 36-pound injectors. We eventually went up to a larger injector size when we started adding boost. So this is what we ran on our naturally aspirated combination, and this thing actually did fairly well. Our naturally aspirated 4.6.2 valve with basically ported heads, the extreme energy 274 cam, and the PI intake manifold made 390 horsepower and almost matching 384 foot-pounds of torque. But here's what happened when we added the Vortech supercharger. This was a kit that they sold back in the day, and it was run, I'll go ahead and put the pulley sizes up here so you guys can kind of get an idea how fast the blower is spinning. I believe that this was an S-trim supercharger. It also had the Vortech air-to-water aftercooler, intercooler setup on it. And I can tell you that this thing made, the power jumped up to over 600 horsepower, 624 horsepower. Peak torque was up to 544 foot-pounds of torque. And I can tell you at this power level, this particular core, this air-to-water intercooler core, was probably becoming fairly restrictive. I didn't test the drop in pressure on this test before and after this core, but we've run this same size core on 5-liter Ford applications, and specifically on a 351 Windsor application, where we replaced this core with a bigger core and picked up quite a bit of boost and power. So we know at this 600 plus horsepower level, this core was probably restrictive. But this is what our combination did with a Vortech supercharger. So now let's take a look at our next combination run with twin turbos. Our second test motor had similar modifications. It was actually also an early non-PI short block. It was equipped with ported non-PI heads, and these particular non-PI heads were the guys from Ford Performance Solutions. They actually modified them to accept a PI intake manifold. So in addition to be porting, they welded them up so that they would accept the better PI manifold. It had slightly smaller camshafts in this combination. It had the Extreme Energy Comp 262 AH cams, so they had slightly less duration than the 274 non-PI cams that we ran in the other combination, but more lift. They went up from 500 to 550 lift. So slightly less duration, slightly more lift, and had both of them had ported heads, both of them had PI intake manifolds, but this one actually made slightly less power, and we'll show that comparison in just a minute. It produced 365 horsepower and 372 foot-pounds of naturally aspirated trim. It was run with the fast XFI, same injectors, and same long tube headers. And here's what happened when we installed our twin turbo kit from the guys at HP Performance. It had twin 46mm turbos, a front-mounted air-to-air intercooler, and was running the exhaust manifold supplied with the kit. The turbos were mounted up in front, up in the fender wells, basically, with a big front-mounted air-to-air intercooler, and it worked fairly well. The system had plenty of potential. This was easy power for this particular combination. Run at about 10 pounds of boost. It made 614 horsepower and 604 foot-pounds of torque. And here's what happened after we turned the boost up to about 15 pounds, 14.9 pounds. Power output jumped to 713 horsepower and 717 foot-pounds of torque. So now that we've taken a look at what the turbo does on this combination, let's compare the combinations. Let's compare the supercharged combination versus the turbo combination, both in power and boost level, so that we can understand the difference between the supercharging and turbocharging on these two mod motors. We need to take a look at what the starting difference was for these, and let's take a look at the NA power outputs. This was our 390 horsepower hybrid, the early non-PI version with the ported PI heads. And here's how it compares to our second test motor. You can see that the hybrid version, the early non-PI version with the ported PI heads and the bigger cams, made slightly more horsepower than the second test version, which has had the ported non-PI heads and the smaller camshafts. So you're talking about 365 horsepower versus 390 horsepower to start out. And this is important because when we look at the difference between the turbocharged version and the supercharged version, it kind of gives us a better idea. So let's take a look at that. Here is our supercharged version. This is our supercharged non-PI hybrid combination with the Vortech and the intercooler, running at 11 pounds of boost or so. And here's what happened when we ran our first turbocharged version with the other motor, and you can kind of see how they compare. And you can see they're running similar boost levels. The turbo motor actually is running, and we'll take a look at the boost curves. The turbo version at the top is actually running slightly less boost than the supercharged version is. But the important thing to look at here is how much more power, and we'll see this indicated in the boost curves as well, in red, how much more power the turbo version is making than the centrifugal supercharged version because of the change in the boost response. In a centrifugal version, centrifugal supercharger, it has a rising boost curve. So down here at 3,000 RPM, it might only be making a couple of pounds of boost. But out at the top is where it makes peak boost. Whereas the turbo basically can have, if you size it properly, can have a nice flat boost curve all the way across. So down here at 3,700 RPM, the difference in torque between the two combinations, for the centrifugal supercharged version, 413 foot-pounds. For the turbo version, 556 foot-pounds. And again, we'll see this when we take a look at the boost curves. And obviously, what we did with the turbo version, which is a little more difficult, we could change the pulley on the Vortech, but it was very easy to change the boost on the turbocharged version because all we had to do was adjust our manual wastegate controller. And when we did that, we see obviously a whole bunch more power, over 700 horsepower, and way over 700 foot-pounds of torque on the turbo version. So there's plenty of power left to be had there. And as I said, I think that the intercooler was probably a little bit restrictive on the Vortech combination. But now let's take a look at and maybe if I get rid of these, you guys can kind of get a better idea here. Let's get rid of torque. You can just kind of see these are the horsepower curves. Blue is the Vortech. Green is the turbo at 10 pounds, and red is the horsepower of the twin turbo at about 15 pounds. So now let's take a look at our boost curves, and you can kind of see why they're doing this. To illustrate why there's such a big difference in the power curves offered by the twin turbo setup versus the Vortech setup, we only need to look at the boost curves here, and this will show you what's going on really and why one of them made the turbo combinations make a lot more average power. It's because it makes a lot more average boost pressure. This is the boost curve offered by the Vortech Supercharger on our hybrid version, the non-PI short block with the ported PI heads and the 274 cams. At 3,000 RPM, it's starting out about 2.4 pounds of boost, and doesn't reach 11.5 pounds out here until 6,100 RPM. By comparison, here's what the twin turbo combination look like. Much flatter curve. Starts out, we started this thing at about 3,500 RPM, where it was already making 9 pounds of boost, and it had a slight increase to about just over 10.1 pounds. The interesting thing is, and if you look at this is kind of telling, that where the crossover is on these two, where they started making the same boost, was 5,750 RPM. At 5,800 RPM, despite the fact that the Vortech was making more boost than the turbos were, this turbo combination was still making more power. And it's important to note, and this is why I showed you all the information, that The NA power output of the turbo combination was also about 25 horsepower less than the supercharged combination. So it was starting out as a deficit, but yet it more than held its own and in fact made a little bit more power at the same boost. So if it were starting out with that extra 25 horsepower, the difference between the turbo and the supercharged combination would be even greater. At the same boost, the turbo combinations almost always make more power because they don't have the parasitic losses associated with driving a supercharger. That doesn't take anything away from the Vortech. I ran a Vortech on my 5-liter Mustang for years and years and years and loved it. It was fantastic. I mean, the difference between having an NA motor and a boosted motor is dramatic. So the Vortech works good. But if you want something that provides a different power curve and a different boost curve, obviously turbos are a viable option. And here's what happened, and you can take a look and see the same kind of thing happen when we raised the boost. We had a slight rising boost curve when we turned the boost up to a peak of 14.9 pounds. It started out here at 12.7 pounds and rose slightly up to 6,100 RPM. So again, turbo stuff has a good average power production because it has good average boost production. Let's get to our conclusion. Okay, guys, what do we learn from this comparison between the Vortech Centrifugal Supercharger and the twin turbos run on our pair of 4.6-liter 2-valve mod motors? Here's really the takeaway, and this is usually what happens. If you compare a supercharger to a turbo, it could be twin turbos or a single, they're both going to do the same thing. The turbo will typically make more power at any given boost level, only because it doesn't have the parasitic losses associated with driving the blower. And the faster that you spin the blower and the more boost you're trying to produce and the more air that you're processing through the blower, the greater the parasitic loss. So at really high boost levels and really high power levels, there's even more of a loss on the blower stuff. But that's not really what's important here. What I really want you to look at is take a look at the difference between the boost and the power curves. Take a look at why one of them offers a lot more average power production. Now, I love the centrifugal supercharger I had on my Mustang, and I drove it around for like 80,000 miles, and it was fantastic. But if you look at the boost curves, you can see the centrifugal has a rising boost curve, where the turbos have kind of a flat boost curve obviously after the turbos come up. But when they do that, when they have this, when they're making 10 pounds at 3,500 or so, they're just going to offer a lot more torque than the centrifugal does. But here's really the key, and here's the takeaway. I like having all of these to choose from, whether it's a centrifugal, turbos, positive displacement, roof blower, all of those things are great. They all offer different things. And really the key here is that the difference between having a naturally aspirated motor and a boosted motors rule. I'm Richard Holder. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff. More testing coming up.